What do you think will happen when you grow old and face life alone? Imagine waking up one day in a house that was once full of life, where every corner held a memory of laughter, love, and togetherness. Now all that's left is silence. This is a reality for millions of people. Growing old isn't something most of us prepare for. We focus on building careers, raising families, and living in the moment. But as the years go by, life slows down, and we're left with a truth we're rarely ready to face: loneliness. Today, I want to share with you the story of Jack Thompson, a man who faced this reality head-on. At 62, Jack seemed to have everything figured out: a happy family, a successful career, and a retirement plan that most would envy. But when his beloved wife passed away, Jack's perfect world began to unravel. His children grew distant, busy with their own lives. The house he once called home became a reminder of everything he had lost. And Jack found himself asking a question no one ever wants to ask: what do I do now? This story isn't just about Jack's struggles, it's about his transformation. It's about finding purpose, connection, and joy in the face of life's most challenging moments. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll not only hear Jack's story, but you might also discover something about your own. Jack Thompson lived a life that many would envy. For decades, he had been a dedicated engineer, working long hours to provide for his family. He built a home filled with love, laughter, and memories alongside his wife, Sarah, and their two children, Adam and Emily. Life was busy, but Jack always had something to look forward to: family dinners, weekend soccer games, and quiet evenings with Sarah after the kids had gone to bed. When Jack retired at 60, he finally felt like he could slow down and enjoy the fruits of his labor. He and Sarah had plans, big plans. They dreamed of traveling across the country in an RV, visiting national parks, and spending lazy afternoons fishing by the lake. But just as they began to settle into this new chapter, life took an unexpected turn. Sarah started feeling unwell, persistent fatigue, a nagging pain in her back. At first, they thought it was nothing serious. But after weeks of tests and hospital visits, they received the diagnosis that no one ever wants to hear: cancer. It was aggressive and advanced. Jack became Sarah's full-time caregiver, putting all his energy into making her as comfortable as possible. For months, their lives revolved around doctor's appointments, treatments, and moments of hope followed by devastating setbacks. Sarah passed away just a year after her diagnosis, leaving Jack utterly heartbroken. In the days following her funeral, the house felt impossibly empty. Jack would wake up each morning, expecting to see Sarah sitting by the window with her cup of tea, but she wasn't there. He would catch himself reaching for the phone to call her, only to remember she was gone. The first few weeks were filled with visits and calls from friends and family. Adam and Emily tried their best to support their dad, but they had their own lives to manage. Adam had a demanding job and two young children. Emily lived several states away and was constantly traveling for work. As the weeks turned into months, the visits and calls became less frequent. Jack didn't blame them. They had their own families, their own responsibilities. But the quiet in the house grew louder with each passing day. Jack tried to keep himself busy. He cleaned out the garage, sorted through old photos, and reorganized the pantry. He spent hours tending to the garden, something he and Sarah had always enjoyed doing together. But no matter how much he kept his hands occupied, his mind always wandered back to the same thought: what am I supposed to do now? One evening, Jack sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Sarah used to sit. On the coffee table lay an unfinished crossword puzzle she had started the week before she passed. The pencil was still resting on the page, as if she had just stepped away and would return any moment. Jack picked it up, stared at the half-filled boxes, and felt an overwhelming wave of sadness. That night, Adam called. "Hey Dad, just checking in. How are you holding up?" Jack tried to sound upbeat. "I'm doing fine, son. Don't worry about me." But Adam could sense the heaviness in his father's voice. "I'm sorry I haven't been able to visit more," he said. "Work's been crazy and the kids have so much going on." "It's okay," Jack replied. "I know you're busy. Take care of your family. That's what matters." After hanging up, Jack sat alone in the silence. He realized something he had been avoiding. This wasn't a temporary phase. This loneliness wasn't going to go away on its own. As the weeks turned into months, Jack's routine became monotonous. He would wake up at 7 a.m., have the same breakfast of toast and coffee, and then spend hours aimlessly wandering around the house. Sometimes he would sit by the window watching cars drive by or kids riding their bikes down the street, all while feeling a growing disconnect from the world outside. The house began to feel less like a home and more like a prison of memories. In the kitchen, he could still see Sarah's handwritten notes on recipe cards tucked neatly in a box. He hadn't had the heart to move them. The smell of her perfume still lingered faintly on her favorite scarf, hanging on the back of the bedroom door. Jack decided he needed to do something, anything, to break the cycle of stillness. One day, he ventured out to the grocery store, hoping a change of scenery would help. As he pushed his cart down the aisles, he saw couples shopping together, exchanging smiles as they picked out produce or debated over which brand of coffee to buy. The small, intimate moments that once felt ordinary now seemed like a distant dream. Jack's heart ached as he stood in the frozen food section, staring blankly at the shelves. He reached for a pack of single-serve dinners and realized that this was his new reality: meals for one. No shared dinner conversations. No Sarah asking, "Do you want dessert?" It was just him. As he left the store, Jack noticed an elderly couple sitting on a bench outside, sharing an ice cream cone. They were laughing about something, their joy radiating in the late afternoon sun. For a moment, Jack felt an unexpected surge of anger. Why them? Why do they still have each other when Sarah is gone? But the anger quickly turned to guilt. He didn't want to feel this way. Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to feel this way. That evening, Jack sat in his living room, flipping through an old photo album. Each picture brought back a wave of emotions. Sarah smiling on their wedding day, Adam and Emily as toddlers playing in the backyard, family vacations to the beach. The photos were a reminder of how full his life had once been. But they also reminded him of how empty it felt now. As the days dragged on, Jack began to notice a subtle shift in his own thoughts. He started questioning the purpose of it all. What was he living for now? His children were busy with their own lives. His wife, his partner, and everything was gone. And the house, once a place of joy, now felt like a museum of memories. One particularly quiet afternoon, Jack decided to call Emily. Her voice was warm and familiar, but as they spoke, Jack couldn't help but notice how rushed she sounded. "Dad, I'd love to talk longer, but I've got a meeting in 5 minutes, she said. "Can I call you later this week?" "Of course, sweetheart," Jack replied. "Don't worry about me. Take care of your work." When the call ended, Jack stared at his phone for a long time. He realized that he was saying the same thing over and over, "Don't worry about me." But deep down he wished someone would. A few days later, Jack had another conversation that would stay with him for weeks. His neighbor John, who was in his late 60s and also widowed, stopped by to check on him. As they sat on Jack's porch, sipping coffee, John spoke openly about his own struggles with loneliness. "It's tough, isn't it?" John said, looking out at the quiet street. "I always thought I'd have more time with my wife, but life has its own plans." Jack nodded, feeling a deep connection to John's words. "It's the silence that gets to me," Jack admitted. "I thought I was ready for retirement, but I wasn't ready for this." John leaned forward, his tone serious. "You've got to think ahead, Jack. What's your plan if you're left completely alone? Who's going to be there for you when you really need someone?" The question caught Jack off guard. He didn't have an answer. He had always assumed his children would be there, but was that fair to expect? They had their own families, their own responsibilities. That night, as Jack lay in bed, John's words echoed in his mind. "What's your plan?" The truth was he didn't have one. He had spent his entire life taking care of others, his wife, his children, even his colleagues at work. But now, when it came to taking care of himself, he didn't know where to start. The next morning, Jack woke up feeling restless. He decided to do something he hadn't done in years: go for a walk in the park. The last time he'd been there, it had been with Sarah. They used to sit on the benches watching the ducks in the pond and talking about everything and nothing. As Jack walked through the park, he felt a mix of emotions. The laughter of children, the sight of couples holding hands, the sound of dogs barking in the distance. It was all a reminder of what he had lost. But then, something unexpected happened. Jack noticed a group of seniors sitting together on a bench, laughing and chatting like old friends. There was an energy about them, a sense of camaraderie that Jack hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment he hesitated. Should he approach them? Would they welcome him, or would he feel like an outsider? But then one of the seniors, a woman with a warm smile and a spark in her eyes, waved him over. "Come join us," she said. "We've got plenty of room." Her name was Margaret, and little did Jack know, meeting her would change everything. The day after John's visit, Jack couldn't shake the weight of their conversation. The silence of his home, which he had grown accustomed to, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, almost mocking him. For the first time, Jack realized he wasn't just living alone. He was waiting. Waiting for Adam to call, waiting for Emily to visit, waiting for something to pull him out of the endless monotony. But John's words wouldn't let him wait any longer. "What's your plan if you're left completely alone?" That afternoon, Jack forced himself to take a walk around the block, a small but symbolic gesture. It wasn't much, but it was something different. As he stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hit his face, and for the first time in months, he noticed the world beyond his front door. The golden leaves swirling along the sidewalk, the faint laughter of children. Playing in the distance, the rhythmic sound of a jogger's footsteps. All of it reminded him that life was still happening, even if his own had felt like it had stopped. Jack's feet carried him further to the edge of the local park. It had been years since Jack had stepped foot there. Back when Sarah was alive and they would take afternoon strolls, stopping to watch the ducks glide across the pond. Now the park felt different. It was alive with activity. Families picnicking, children chasing each other on the grass, and seniors sitting in the shade, chatting and laughing. Jack hesitated at the entrance, unsure of where to go or if he even belonged here anymore. But then he noticed a group of older adults gathered around a bench, their laughter ringing out above the ambient noise. There was something magnetic about their energy, something that pulled at Jack's curiosity. Jack stood there for a moment, feeling out of place. What would I even say? He thought. But just as he was about to turn back toward home, one of the women in the group spotted him. She had a vibrant smile and an inviting presence. "Hey there," she called out, waving him over. "Don't just stand there, come join us." The sudden attention startled Jack, but there was no backing out now. He adjusted his jacket nervously and made his way over to the bench. "Hi, I'm Margaret," the woman said warmly, extending her hand. "And these are my partners in crime," she added, gesturing to the others. "This is Carl, our resident comedian, Diane, who keeps us all in check, and Tom, who doesn't talk much but is probably smarter than all of us combined." The group chuckled, and Jack felt a small smile tug at the corners of his lips. "I'm Jack," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. It's nice to meet you all." "Welcome to our little Thursday club," Margaret said. "No rules, no fees, just good company." Jack sat at the edge of the bench, unsure of what to say. The group, however, seemed completely at ease. Margaret took the lead, asking him simple questions. Where he lived, how long he'd been in the neighborhood, and what brought him to the park. Jack answered cautiously at first, but there was something about the way Margaret spoke, gentle, curious but never prying, that made it easier to open up. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house," Jack admitted after a pause. "It's been a tough year. My wife passed away a while back, and things haven't felt the same since." The group grew quiet for a moment, the weight of Jack's words settling over them. Then Diane, the former nurse, placed a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Jack. Losing someone you love, it's a kind of pain that doesn't have a timeline, does it?" Jack nodded, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. "No, it doesn't. Some days it feels like it just happened." Carl, always one to lighten the mood, chimed in. "Well, Jack, you've come to the right place. This group? We're all experts at figuring out how to live with a little bit of heartbreak." As the conversation continued, Jack began to notice something unexpected. Everyone in the group carried their own scars, yet they seemed lighter than he felt. Margaret shared how she had lost her husband 5 years ago after a sudden heart attack. "I thought I'd never laugh again," she said, her voice steady but her eyes soft. "But here I am, proving myself wrong every day." Diane spoke about caring for her aging parents while battling her own health challenges. Carl cracked jokes about his arthritis, calling it his daily reminder to keep moving even when it hurt. What struck Jack wasn't just their stories but how they talked about them, with a kind of acceptance he hadn't yet found in himself. They didn't dwell on the pain or pretend it didn't exist. Instead, they had somehow folded it into their lives, carrying it with grace. Margaret turned to Jack and smiled. "You know, none of us came here expecting to find this group. We all started like you, just looking for a way to get through the day. But sometimes showing up is all it takes to find what you didn't know you needed." Jack listened quietly as the group continued to share their experiences. There was something comforting about their honesty, how they acknowledged their struggles but didn't let them define their lives. For the first time in months, Jack felt a flicker of belonging, even if he wasn't quite ready to admit it to himself. Margaret broke his thoughts. "Jack, why don't you join us here next week? Same time, same bench. We usually meet on Thursdays, rain or shine." Her tone was casual, but her eyes held a warmth that made the invitation feel genuine. Jack hesitated. "I don't know. I'm not really good at, this kind of thing," he said, gesturing vaguely at the group. Carl chuckled. "Good at what? Sitting and talking? Trust me, you're overqualified." The group laughed, and even Jack couldn't help but smile. Margaret leaned in slightly. "No pressure, Jack. But if you're looking for a place where you can just be yourself, this is it. Think about it." Jack nodded, not making any promises but already knowing deep down that he would return. As Jack walked home from the park that afternoon, Margaret's invitation replayed in his mind. There was a part of him that wanted to dismiss it, to retreat back into the solitude of his house where he felt safe, if not content. But another part of him, smaller but growing louder, felt something he hadn't in months: hope. The memory of the group's laughter echoed in his ears, and Jack found himself smiling for no reason at all. It felt foreign, almost unnatural, to let his guard down after spending so long bracing himself against the pain of loss. But Margaret's words lingered. "If you're looking for a place where you can just be yourself, this is it." Back at home, Jack sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the empty chair across from him. The silence was still there, heavy and familiar, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite as suffocating. He realized that the loneliness wasn't just about losing Sarah, it was about losing himself. The group at the park had reminded him that there was still life to be lived, even if it looked different now. The following Thursday, Jack stood by his front door, keys in hand, debating whether to go back to the park. His old insecurities whispered in his ear, "What if you don't fit in? What if they're just being polite?" But louder than those doubts was the memory of Margaret's smile, the warmth in her voice when she said, "This is a place where you can just be yourself." With a deep breath, Jack stepped outside and started walking. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves. As he approached the park, Jack's heart beat faster. But when he saw the group gathered at the same bench, laughing as if they had been waiting just for him, the tension in his chest began to ease. "Look who decided to join us," Margaret exclaimed, waving him over. Diane scooted over to make room and Carl grinned. "We were just about to vote you off the island, Jack." Jack chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "Guess I made it just in time." As Jack settled into the bench, he realized how different this moment felt compared to his usual afternoons at home. Here the air was filled with stories, jokes, and a kind of lightness that felt contagious. Margaret started talking about her gardening mishaps, how she accidentally planted flowers that attracted bees, much to her neighbors' dismay. Carl shared a story about a prank he once pulled on his students back in his teaching days, earning laughter from the entire group. Jack found himself relaxing, even contributing a story of his own, a memory of a family road trip gone hilariously wrong when their car broke down in the middle of nowhere. The group laughed heartily, and for the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like an outsider. He felt included, part of something bigger than himself. Margaret leaned over and said, "See, Jack? You fit right in." No one's keeping score here. We're just here to enjoy the time we have." Her words struck a chord, and Jack realized how much he had been missing this kind of connection. Simple, genuine moments shared with others. Later that evening, as Jack walked back home under the golden glow of the streetlights, he felt a quiet warmth in his chest. It wasn't the same kind of joy he used to feel when Sarah was alive or when Adam and Emily were young. It was something different. Subtle, yet significant. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack wasn't rushing to escape his thoughts. Instead, he let them linger. He thought about the group, how they had welcomed him without hesitation, their laughter and stories weaving a sense of familiarity he hadn't expected. He thought about Margaret's words, "We're just here to enjoy the time we have." It wasn't advice he had sought, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Jack realized that for years he had been living for others. His wife, his children, his career. And while that life had brought him joy, it had also left him unprepared for the one thing he'd never considered: how to live for himself. The next Thursday, Jack arrived at the park earlier than usual, surprising even himself. Margaret noticed him first, waving him over with a smile. "Early bird today, Jack. I like it." As the group settled in, their usual banter began, but Margaret, ever perceptive, turned to Jack and said, "So, Jack, you've been coming here for a couple of weeks now. What's next?" Jack looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, what's next?" Margaret leaned forward, her expression kind but serious. "You've taken a great first step by joining us, but life isn't just about showing up. It's about participating. What's something you've always wanted to do but never made time for? Or something you used to love but gave up on?" Her question took Jack off guard. He hadn't thought about his own passions in years. "I used to paint," he said hesitantly. "Sarah always encouraged me, but I haven't picked up a brush since she passed." Margaret's eyes lit up. "Well, there's your answer. It's time to dust off those paints, Jack. Let's see what you've got." That evening, Jack stood in the corner of his attic, staring at a dusty box labeled "Art Supplies." It had been years since he last opened it, and the thought of revisiting something so deeply tied to his memories of Sarah made his chest tighten. But Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Life isn't just about showing up, it's about participating. Taking a deep breath, he opened the box. Inside were his old brushes, tubes of paint, some dried up, and a few blank canvases. He carried the box downstairs, clearing a small corner of the living room, by the window where the evening light streamed in. The first stroke on the canvas felt awkward, almost foreign, but as Jack continued, his hands began to remember what his heart had forgotten. The colors flowed together, forming a simple landscape, a field of wildflowers under a golden sky. When he stepped back to admire his work, a small, unexpected smile crossed his face. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. The following Thursday, Jack arrived at the park with a small painting tucked under his arm, wrapped carefully in brown paper. He hadn't planned on sharing it with the group, but something about their warmth made him feel like it was the right thing to do. As he approached the bench, Margaret immediately noticed the package. "What have you got there, Jack?" she asked with a playful grin. Jack hesitated, holding the painting tightly. "It's just something I've been working on. Nothing fancy." Margaret reached out her hands. "Well, don't just stand there. Let's see it." With a nervous laugh, Jack handed her the painting. She carefully unwrapped it, and the group leaned in, their faces lighting up as the vibrant colors came into view. "Jack, this is beautiful," Margaret exclaimed, her voice full of genuine admiration. Carl let out a low whistle. "You've been holding out on us. We've got an artist in the group." The praise warmed Jack in a way he hadn't felt in years. "It's just a start," he said modestly, but inside he felt a flicker of pride. For the first time in a long time, he had created something, and it felt like a small piece of himself had come back to life. Margaret carefully handed the painting back to Jack, her eyes twinkling. "You know, Jack, this is more than just a start. It's proof that you're still in there, somewhere underneath all that sadness." Her words were gentle but firm, cutting through the walls Jack had built around himself. "You've got a gift, and gifts like this aren't meant to stay hidden. What would Sarah say if she saw this?" Jack's throat tightened at the mention of Sarah, but he didn't look away. He knew exactly what she would say. "You've still got it, Jack. Don't stop now." Margaret leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "How about this? Next week you bring your paints here. We'll make a morning of it, you, me, and the group. Let's see what kind of masterpiece we can create together." Jack hesitated, unsure if he was ready to share his creative process so openly. But the way Margaret spoke, with such enthusiasm and conviction, made it hard to say no. "All right," he said with a small smile. "Next week I'll bring the paints." The next Thursday, Jack arrived at the park carrying a small box of paints, brushes, and a blank canvas. The group erupted in mock cheers as they saw him approach. "Look at this. Our very own Picasso has arrived," Carl teased, earning a round of laughter. Margaret patted the bench beside her. "Come on, Jack. Let's see those skills in action." Jack set up his supplies under the shade of a large tree, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared his palette. He wasn't sure if he could paint with an audience. He had always painted for himself, in the quiet solitude of his home. But as he looked at the group's expectant faces, he felt something shift inside him. He began with slow, deliberate strokes, letting the brush guide him. The group watched in awe as a field of sunflowers began to take shape on the canvas, the vibrant yellows and greens capturing the warmth of the late morning sun. "Jack, this is incredible," Diane said softly, her voice filled with genuine admiration. For the first time in years, Jack felt truly present, not lost in memories, not burdened by grief, but fully immersed in the act of creation. Jack added the final touches to his painting. He stepped back to look at his work. The sunflowers seemed to glow with life, and for a moment he felt a surge of pride, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The group clapped softly, their appreciation genuine. Margaret leaned closer, studying the details. "Jack, this feels like joy. It's beautiful." Jack hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't think I'd be able to do this again," he admitted quietly. "But being here with all of you, it feels different. Lighter." Margaret smiled, her voice soft but steady. "That's because we're not meant to carry everything alone, Jack. Sometimes just having someone to share the moment with makes all the difference." Jack looked around at the group, their faces bright with encouragement, and realized she was right. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was struggling to stay afloat. He was part of something, a small, imperfect but meaningful community that gave him a reason to show up. As the group packed up for the day, Margaret turned to Jack with her usual warm smile. "Same time next week?" she asked, as if it were already a given. Jack nodded, surprising himself with how easily the answer came. "Yeah, I think I'll be here." The others chimed in with their goodbyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't dread going home. As he walked back, carrying his painting under his arm, he noticed how different the world felt. The same streets, the same houses, but now there was a small, comforting certainty. He wasn't as alone as he had believed. That evening, Jack hung the painting on the wall near the window, where the soft glow of the sunset illuminated it. The image of the sunflowers seemed to fill the room with warmth, banishing the shadows that had lingered for far too long. He sat in his favorite chair, a cup of tea in hand, and thought about the group, their laughter, their stories, and the way they made him feel like he mattered again. As the days passed, Jack began to notice subtle changes in himself. He no longer spent his mornings aimlessly, wandering around the house or sitting in front of the TV for hours. Instead, he found himself planning for Thursdays, looking forward to the laughter, the stories, and the small but meaningful moments with tea one evening. He even caught himself flipping through an old sketchbook, rediscovering unfinished ideas that once inspired him. With each rediscovered memory, Jack felt a growing sense of purpose, a reminder that, and while the grief over losing Sarah still lingered, it likely always would, he was beginning to understand that his life could hold both sorrow and joy. The two weren't mutually exclusive. Margaret and the group had taught him that. Jack realized something that night as he stared at the sunflower painting on his wall. Healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on completely. It simply meant finding new ways to carry the past forward while making space for the PR. The next Thursday, as Jack walked to the park with his paints in hand, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just passing time anymore, he was living it, one step, one stroke, and one shared moment at a time. Jack's Thursdays at the park quickly became the highlight of his week. Over time, the group grew to feel less like acquaintances and more like family. Margaret's infectious energy kept everyone on their toes, Carl's humor always lightened the mood, and Diane's sage advice gave Jack new ways to reflect on his own life. Even Tom, who rarely spoke, began to open up around Jack, sharing small but meaningful snippets of his own journey for Jack. These moments weren't just distractions, they were lifelines. He began to notice how his outlook on life was shifting. He no longer felt like he was simply passing the days, waiting for something to happen. Instead, he was creating moments of joy and connection, one brushstroke, one story, and one laugh at a time. One Thursday morning, Margaret surprised the group with an idea. "Why don't we organize a little art exhibit at the community center?" she said, her eyes sparkling. "Jack's paintings deserve to be seen, and I'm sure we've all got something to contribute. Photos, crafts, or even Carl's terrible jokes printed on paper for POS." The group erupted in laughter, but Jack froze. The idea of his paintings being displayed felt overwhelming. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, trying to brush it off. "I'm just painting." Margaret, never one to back down, shook her head. "Jack, you've got talent, and talent is meant to be shared. Besides, this isn't about showing off, it's about celebrating how far we've all come. You don't have to decide now." Jack spent the next few days wrestling with the idea. The thought of putting his work on display felt vulnerable, almost exposing. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it was time to take another step. After days of hesitation, Jack found himself standing in his living room, surrounded by his paintings. Each one told a different story. Some reflected his grief, others his quiet moments of joy, and a few captured the new sense of belonging he had found with Margaret and the group. Jack thought back to something Margaret had said: "Sharing your work doesn't take away from its meaning, it adds to it." The following Thursday, Jack arrived at the park with a determined look on his face. "All right," he said, setting his coffee down on the bench. "Let's do it. Let's organize the exhibit." The group cheered, with Margaret clapping the loudest. "That's the spirit, Jack," she exclaimed. "We'll make it something special." Over the next few weeks, the group threw themselves into preparations. Diane volunteered to handle the logistics, Carl spread the word throughout the community, and Margaret became Jack's unofficial coach, encouraging him to push past his insecurities. One afternoon, as Jack painted in the park, Margaret sat beside him. "You know, Jack," she said, watching the colors come to life on his canvas, "this isn't just about art. It's about showing yourself that there's more to life than what we've lost." The community center buzzed with life on the day of the exhibit. The group had transformed the modest hall into a vibrant display of creativity. Jack's paintings took center stage, surrounded by Diane's hand-woven scarves, Margaret's small garden flower arrangements, and even a wall of Carl's infamous dad jokes, which were already drawing laughter from the crowd. Jack stood near the entrance, adjusting the collar of his shirt nervously. "What if no one likes them?" he murmured to Margaret, who stood beside him, her arms crossed confidently. Margaret smiled, her voice steady. "Jack, it's not about them liking it. It's about you putting yourself out there. This is your moment, and no one can take that from you." As the first visitors arrived, Jack watched anxiously as they stopped to admire his work. One woman lingered by a painting of a field of sunflowers, the same one Jack had created during one of his first Thursdays with the group. She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. "This reminds me of the sunflower fields my husband and I used to visit," she said. "It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing this." For the first time, Jack felt a deep sense of pride, not just in his art but in the courage it took to share it. As the evening went on, more visitors stopped to admire Jack's work. Each compliment, each thoughtful comment, chipped away at the doubts that had held him back for so long. He found himself talking with people he'd never met before, sharing the stories behind his paintings, how some were inspired by Sarah, others by the group's laughter in the park, and a few by his journey of rediscovering himself. One man approached Jack with a handshake. "Your work has so much heart," he said. "It's rare to see art that feels this personal." You've reminded me that it's never too late to start creating again." Jack felt his chest swell with pride. These were strangers, yet they connected with his art, and, in a way, with him. Margaret, watching from across the room, gave him a knowing smile and a thumbs up. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't just existing, he was part of something bigger. The exhibit wasn't just about paintings or crafts. It was about sharing pieces of their lives and realizing that those pieces mattered. When the exhibit finally came to an end, Jack found himself standing alone in the now empty community center. The once bustling hall was quiet, the echoes of laughter and conversation fading into the stillness of the night. He looked around at the empty walls where his paintings had hung, remembering the faces of the people who had stopped to admire them. Margaret approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing him one. Jack took the cup and gave her a small smile. "Thanks. I don't know what I would have done without you, Margaret." Margaret waved him off playfully. "Oh, please. You did all the hard work. I just gave you a little push." Jack's gaze softened as he looked at her. "It wasn't just the paintings. It was everything. You, and this group, you've given me something I didn't think I'd have again." Margaret tilted her head, her expression kind. "What's that?" "Hope," Jack said simply. For a moment they sat in silence, sipping their coffee. It wasn't an empty silence, but one filled with understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of how far Jack had come. As Jack walked home that evening, the cool breeze carried a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. His steps were lighter, his heart fuller. When he reached his door, he noticed something unusual, an envelope sitting on the welcome mat. There was no postage, just his name written in neat, familiar hand. Jack picked it up, his brow furrowing as he stepped inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Carefully, he opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, and as he began to read, his hands trembled slightly. "Dear Dad, I know I haven't said this enough, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know things have been hard since Mom passed, and I felt guilty for not being there as much as I should have. Work and life have a way of pulling me in 1,000 directions, but I want you to know that you're always in my thoughts. Emily and I were talking recently, and we've both decided it's time we step up. We've been so focused on our own lives that we forgot the man who made it all possible. You deserve better from us. So, we've been planning something. It's not ready yet, but we're working on a way to bring the family together more often, to create new memories, not just dwell on the old ones. You've always been our rock, Dad, and it's time we showed you just how much that means to us. I hope tonight at your exhibit you realized what we've always known. You still have so much to give to this world and to us. We love you more than words can say. Love, Adam." Jack's eyes blurred with tears as he read the letter, again letting the words sink in. For so long he had felt forgotten, a shadow in his children's busy lives. But this letter was a reminder that love, even when it feels distant, never truly disappears. He placed the letter gently on the table and looked up at the sunflower painting hanging on the wall. It wasn't just a symbol of his own renewal, it was a reminder that life could bloom again, even in the most unexpected ways. The next morning, as the sunlight poured into his living room, Jack sat with a cup of tea, thinking about what lay ahead. His life was no longer defined by loss or waiting. He had found his community, rediscovered his purpose, and now he had a future to look forward to, a future filled with art, laughter, and most importantly, the people he loved. That Thursday at the park, Jack shared the letter with Margaret and the group. As they read it, Margaret looked at him with a proud smile. "I told you, Jack, when you start showing up for life, life shows up for you." Jack chuckled. "You're always right, aren't you?" Margaret grinned. "Not always, just when it matters." And for the first time in years, Jack wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. The weeks following the exhibit were some of the best Jack had experienced in years. His paintings were gaining attention at the community center. Adam and Emily were calling more often, and Thursdays at the park had become his sanctuary. But one Thursday, Margaret didn't show up. At first, the group joked about it, maybe she'd overslept or got caught up in her garden. But as the hours ticked by, unease began to settle over them. Margaret was the heartbeat of the group. Her absence was palpable. The next day, Diane called Jack. Her voice was heavy with concern. "Jack, I just got a call from Margaret's daughter. She's in the hospital. It's serious." The news hit Jack like a freight train. Margaret, strong, spirited Margaret, was suddenly vulnerable in a way that felt impossible to reconcile with the woman who had pulled him back into the world. Without thinking, Jack found himself saying, "What hospital? I'm going to see her." Jack walked into the hospital with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. As he approached Margaret's room, the sound of medical monitors and hushed conversations filled the air. He paused at the door, hesitating for a moment. The woman who had been so full of life, who had practically dragged him out of his grief, was now on the other side of that door, fighting her own battle. When he stepped inside, Margaret looked up and smiled weakly. "Jack," she said, her voice softer than usual but still carrying that familiar warmth. "What are you doing here? I thought Thursdays were your painting days." Jack chuckled nervously, pulling a chair closer to her bed. "You didn't show up yesterday. Someone had to check on you." Margaret sighed, her smile fading. "It's nothing dramatic, just age catching up with me." But Jack could see the fatigue in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly. "You've been the one keeping us all together," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it's our turn. Whatever you need, Margaret, we're here." Margaret gave Jack a faint smile, though her eyes were heavy with something unspoken. "You're too kind, Jack," she said softly. "But this isn't about me. It's about all of us. You've been finding your way again, and I can't tell you how proud I am of you." Jack shook his head. "Margaret, I wouldn't have made it this far without you. You've been the glue holding everything together." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, Jack saw something he never expected to see in Margaret: vulnerability. "Jack," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there might come a time when I can't be that glue anymore. Things like this, they remind you how quickly life can change." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "Don't talk like that," he said, his voice cracking. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet." Margaret reached for his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Life doesn't stop, Jack, no matter what happens to me. That group, the connections we've built, they're bigger than any one of us. Promise me you'll keep showing up. Not just for me, but for yourself and for them." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. "I promise," he said, though his heart ached at the thought of losing her. The days following Jack's visit to Margaret were quieter than he expected. She wasn't at the park that Thursday, nor the week after. The group tried to maintain their usual banter, but her absence was a shadow that lingered over them. Jack found himself stepping into a role he hadn't anticipated. Margaret's words at the hospital echoed in his mind: "Promise me you'll keep showing up. Not just for me, but for yourself and for them." He began to realize that the group, just like him, was holding on to Margaret's presence as a source of stability. Now they needed someone to step forward to keep the connection alive. At their next gathering, Jack brought something unexpected: a blank canvas and his paints. He set them up under the familiar oak tree and said, "Margaret might not be here today, but she's the reason we're all sitting here. Let's create something together for her. Each of us can add to it, a memory, a thought, anything." The group hesitated at first, but then Carl grabbed a brush. "All right, Jack, let's make this masterpiece." A few days later, Jack found himself back at the hospital, carrying the group's painting wrapped carefully in brown paper. As he stepped into Margaret's room, he noticed how much weaker she looked. Her eyes, however, lit up when she saw him. "Well, if it isn't the artist himself," Margaret said softly, her voice laced with humor despite her exhaustion. Jack smiled and placed the painting at the foot of her bed. "This isn't just from me," he said, unwrapping it slowly. "It's from all of us." Margaret's eyes widened as the painting came into view. She studied it for a long moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edges. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've all done something incredible." Jack sat beside her, struggling to hold back his emotions. "You're the reason it exists, Margaret. You brought us together. This is our way of saying thank you for everything." Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me, Jack. I always knew you had it in you, not just the painting but the courage to keep going no matter what. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Promise me one more thing," she said. "When I'm gone, don't let this stop. Keep the group alive. Keep showing up, for them and for yourself." Jack swallowed hard and nodded. "I promise, Margaret." As Jack left the hospital, he felt a mix of sadness and determination. Margaret's words had lit a fire in him, one that refused to be extinguished. He realized that her influence wasn't just about the group, it was about how he could live his life moving forward. That evening, Jack sat in his living room, staring at the painting on the wall. It hit him then. His life wasn't just about finding peace, it was about creating it not only for himself but for others. Margaret had passed the torch, and it was up to him to carry it. Paragraph 6. A final visit to Margaret. A few days later, Jack found himself back at the hospital, carrying the group's painting wrapped carefully in brown paper. As he stepped into Margaret's room, he noticed how much weaker she looked. Her eyes, however, lit up when she saw him. "Well, if it isn't the artist himself," Margaret said softly, her voice laced with humor despite her exhaustion. Jack smiled and placed the painting at the foot of her bed. "This isn't just from me," he said, unwrapping it slowly. "It's from all of us." Margaret's eyes widened as the painting came into view. She studied it for a long moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edges. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've all done something incredible." Jack sat beside her, struggling to hold back his emotions. "You're the reason it exists, Margaret. You brought us together. This is our way of saying thank you for everything." Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me, Jack. I always knew you had it in you, not just the painting but the courage to keep going no matter what." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Promise me one more thing," she said. "When I'm gone, don't let this stop. Keep the group alive. Keep showing up, for them and for yourself." Jack swallowed hard and nodded. "I promise, Margaret." As Jack left the hospital, he felt a mix of sadness and determination. Margaret's words had lit a fire in him, one that refused to be extinguished. He realized that her influence wasn't just about the group, it was about how he could live his life moving forward. That evening, Jack sat in his living room, staring at the painting on the wall. It hit him then. His life wasn't just about finding peace, it was about creating it not only for himself but for others. Margaret had passed the torch, and it was up to him to carry it. Jack decided it was time to step fully into his new role. The next Thursday, he arrived at the park with not just his paints but a plan. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice steady. "Margaret would want us to keep moving forward. So today we're going to do something she always encouraged, try something new." The group looked at him curiously, and Jack pulled out a list of activities: hosting a community art class, organizing a charity walk, and even planning a garden project to honor Margaret's memory. The group exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and excitement. "Well, look at you, Jack," Carl said with a grin. "Taking charge, huh?" Jack nodded, a small but confident smile on his face. "It's what Margaret would have wanted. And it's what I want too, to keep building something that matters." As the group rallied behind Jack's plan, the transformation was undeniable. Thursdays at the park became more than just casual meetups. They became opportunities to create, connect, and contribute. Jack organized their first community art class at the local center, inviting others to join in the joy of painting. The class quickly became the garden project, named Margaret's Haven, became their collective mission. Each member brought something unique. Diane sourced flowers, Carl enlisted neighbors to help with the heavy lifting, and even Tom contributed hand-painted signs for the pathways. Jack spearheaded the effort, his determination growing stronger with every meeting. The group's bond deepened, and Jack began to notice something remarkable. He wasn't just leading the group, he was thriving because of them. Every conversation, every laugh, every small victory in their shared projects reminded Jack of the lesson Margaret had taught him. Purpose doesn't find you, you create it. Word of their initiatives spread throughout the community. What started as a small group of friends had grown into a movement. Seniors who had once felt isolated began attending their events, finding the same comfort and connection that Jack had discovered. Younger families joined in too, eager to contribute to the garden or participate in art classes. One day, Adam and Emily came to visit Jack. As they walked through Margaret's haven, Adam paused, looking around at the vibrant flowers and the laughter echoing from a nearby group. "Dad, this is incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've built something amazing here." Jack smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "It's because of Margaret and everyone who showed up." Jack realized that his life had become more than he ever expected. It wasn't just about filling the silence or escaping loneliness, it was about creating a legacy of connection and joy. Margaret's spirit lived on in every flower, every painting, and every Thursday morning under the oak tree. And as Jack stood at the edge of the garden, watching his children laugh with the group, he knew one thing for certain: life, even in its later chapters, could still be full of beauty, purpose, and love. Jack's story isn't just his, it's a reflection of what so many of us face as we grow older: the challenges of loss, loneliness, and the uncertainty of purpose. But his journey proves that it's never too late to rediscover joy, build new connections, and create something meaningful. Now the question is, what will you do with your next chapter? You don't have to wait for a perfect moment to start. Maybe it's joining a local community group, revisiting an old passion, or even reaching out to someone you've drifted apart from. Just like Jack, the first step might feel small, but it can lead to something far greater than you imagined. Jack's life changed when he decided to show up, first at the park, then for Margaret, and finally for himself. His story is proof that even when life feels empty, it's possible to fill it with purpose again. You have that same power within you. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on what you can do today to bring more connection, creativity, and joy into your life. And if you found Jack's journey inspiring, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more stories that remind us all of what's possible, even in life's later chapters. The next step is yours. Will you take it?